Hello and welcome to the audiobook of All the World Wants to Know by Philip Ballerscheff, read by Philip Ballerscheff. As always, you can find a link in the description of this video to the blog post that I'm reading from. With a life as full as his, he had to find the time for all that was expected of him and which he expected of himself, replying to letters and emails, to requests and invitations, to insults and questions, besides the business of maintaining the body in which he lived and the places in which he did that living. Hiring a secretary helped stem this flood considerably. What he read through now on his train ride home were only the most important messages, those that required his attention and couldn't be delegated. That and whatever his friends had written. He and Leon wrote each other long novels about what they were doing while apart. Much of their time went towards composing these messages, which, for all their effort, amounted to diary entries. His last letter, sent 2 days ago. Dear Leon, I've been in a bad mood lately. The weather, partly, and the rest is my personality. Maybe my mood is seasonal. Spring is here, officially, but was struggling to show itself until this Wednesday. The date of the letter helped his friends know which Wednesday he meant. I met a nice young woman the other day in the park. The winds have changed, stopped blowing in from the north. The season is really coming into its own. She looks nothing like Alice, and that's probably what I like about her. Her name is Susan. I never expected to feel this way again. We talked for a while and agreed to meet this Sunday. How is Turkey? I expect a full report, you know. How is your wife adjusting to it? Do tourists have to adapt to the local customs? I know they don't in Dubai, though that might have changed since I was there. It may even have never been that way. I send you this note to thank you for your response. Wish me luck. I'll do the same for you. Love, Julian. He didn't include his last name, Mitchell, on letters addressed to people with whom he was on a first-name basis. Leon was a travel writer. His letters to Julian were the working drafts of his books. The final versions excised all references to personal lives that weren't Leon's. Julian let him publish some of his letters, but only if he, Leon, and his editor all agreed they were good. He knew it was an unreasonable standard, especially for someone with no literary reputation to uphold, but nobody could convince him to give it up. Besides this one concern, he had none. As long as what he wrote was perfect, who cared what it said, or what anyone but they three said about it? One of Leon's books had won a Pulitzer or some other award, partially owing to Julian's correspondence. Julian wasn't sure which book and which award. He made a note to ask Leon. Some people asked him for money. His secretary, knowing what touched his heart and what didn't, made sure to inform Julian of only those cases he would agree to help. His friends and family, mostly. He had an impersonal sympathy for all children that came from not having one himself. Being a father would focus his attention on what belonged to him to the exclusion of other children. Then there was a report from his accountant. Julian skimmed it. All was in order, or else he had overlooked some bad news. This was at a time when money in the bank gathered interest as well as dust. When he called himself a man of independent means, he meant it seriously. Just as he trusted his secretary to stand between him and everyone clamoring for his attention, so too did he give his accountant power over his finances. His accountant's job was to keep him independently wealthy, and to do so in a way that let Julian sleep at night. If he couldn't do that, he should invest wisely and keep quiet about any concerns that weren't financial. The less he knew, the less he could worry about. For the time being, Julian had been able to get his conscience to overlook this caveat. Lastly, and most infrequently, there were letters inviting him to give a talk or to take part in conferences like the one he had just attended. Julian jumped at the chance whenever it was offered. These conferences gave him a concrete idea of who he was and of what he did. He was a man who had lived a fairly interesting life, and who knew how to talk about it. That's why he and other speakers were asked to give their thoughts on a variety of subjects. He knew the letters he and Leon wrote each other helped his reputation. His invitations increased each time he allowed them to be published. Still, if that was all his life amounted to, Leon had fooled everyone into believing Julian had something more to say. What a pathetic tragedy his life was. His only problem was not having enough to do. All these letters from different worlds. Well, the same world, but they seemed separate. One from his accountant, one from each of his friends, unless Julian didn't respond in time, in which case they sent another, and so on and so on. Having kept his personal problems at as far a distance as they could be, he'd grabbed newspapers from a kiosk, one respected, one tabloid, before getting on the train. Their headlines, a mass of crises printed in block letters to evoke big, flat emotions, overwhelmed him. It was like viewing a crowd from above. As long as you could make out one person among the rest, you could turn your attention to whoever you liked, and do it with them too. Once you looked away, however, the chances weren't good that you would find that first person again. The world moved on, no matter what he did. All he could do was read about it and act accordingly. If a new world or Cold War happened, he'd find somewhere to wait it out. Both newspapers warned him of wars, the difference being that the tabloid was more honest about encouraging conflict. The other paper referred to experts only to affirm what it said and what its readership believed. He turned to his window. The patter of raindrops sounded like a child throwing stones to get his attention. He had gone through the Navy for lack of a better idea, and was for that reason surprised when he found some success there. Gone through, he said, to the protests of those who somehow believed that once you were in you could never get out, as if he were still the same person he had been 20 years ago. Once a Marine, always a Marine, they said. Not all his critics on this front had gone through it themselves, but they felt it was all the more important that those who had were proper about what words they used. He kept to the diet of his Navy days, even after retirement, but not the exercise that it made it necessary. He was fat, though not terribly so, and because he wasn't short, Julian couldn't blame it on his having no other place to put the weight but his middle. His wedding ring didn't fit anymore. He had taken it off years ago, and then, perhaps because it no longer cut against his fingers, he had an affair. His divorce, the 5-year anniversary of which was close at hand, meant he had no reason to wear it. His face was soft, far from the bone underneath, as was the rest of him. This brought to mind Bill's letter about his new exercise routine, one which Julian had considered taking up himself. They had met in the Navy and actually kept in touch, rather than just promising each other that they would. Bill often wrote about his children. Julian was faintly jealous of how he always had something to say, but then again, he didn't write often or very much, so maybe his feelings were unfounded. Julian tried to compose a letter in his head, to whom he would figure out later. Both he and Leon had grown up writing letters and stuck to the habits they had learned in childhood, even when they switched to email. A letter takes time to be delivered, so they were taught to say all that they could. Not only did they deliberate on what they had written, but also on what else they should include. Many said the penny post, the telegram, personal phones, and then email would be the death of the art of letter writing. Out of that many predictions, it figures that one would come true. Maybe they would have if not for Julian and Leon and others like them. The work of letter writers is treated as disposable by almost everyone. Leon at least published his, but Julian really did write for himself. Every message is written for an audience, yes, but even those to whom he addressed his letters didn't reread them very often. He knew this and accepted it. If he ever found great success, then and only then would people go through his belongings, letters included, to discover some overlooked detail of his life. He might leave a mess for them, make them work for what they wanted. It wouldn't be a crowd, maybe a few admirers, if that, but people who have shown themselves to be great in one aspect are given more attention in others than they may deserve. Would his letters be cut down to quotes that his admirers then repeated? What about his private theories, which would then be made public and subject to the praise or scorn of those same few people? He insisted, despite all evidence to the contrary, that being his current minor popularity, that nobody would care for him a generation after he died. After all, how many letters of long-dead people has the average person read? Only historians and people like Leon raise that average beyond a probable 0 or a hopeful 2. Julian thought and thought. Nothing came to mind. He set about writing his yearly thank-you letters to his secretary and his accountant. The little variation this form allowed lay in what he thanked them for, which he included to make it more personal. Leon, however, had much to say, but hadn't found time between sightseeing and people-watching to write more than a sentence here and there. He wasn't a man of means, independent or otherwise. Travel writing as an industry and a genre has gone through a few phases. When the world was still new enough to be discovered on the scale of continents, this sort of writing introduced readers to places they knew nothing about. As mass transport by land, air, and sea made explorers of the general public, the role of travel writing changed. No longer could a privileged few, able to fund their voyages privately or through a patron, claim authority based solely on that. This is why those earlier explorers used more ink than Leon did to describe what they saw, either in words or in sketches. Photography made this less common, though not quite obsolete. What really killed the practice was that so many others could visit foreign lands, if only on the page or over the TV or radio, that it made them familiar. When Nixon met Mao, that was the first time many Americans had given much thought to China besides talk of a war. Travel writers now sought authenticity. Others could visit a place, but still not understand it. This is what Leon helped his readers with, and why he had picked up a conversational level of so many languages. Now they could know another country from the comfort of their own. Had Julian not been one of Leon's occasional collaborators, he would have been part of his readership. In a way, he was, but Julian didn't have to pay for what he read. Those readers also wanted to know Mr. Leon Bloom himself. If you read all his books in the order they were written, you could piece together a picture of his life that, while not quite whole, was more revealing than he had intended. Julian's date went as planned. He and Susan explained who they were, then what they wanted, and why they believed to have found it in the person sitting on the bar stool beside them. They exchanged phone numbers and agreed to meet again, not in the vague future, but in 6 days. The next day, Leon received Julian's questions, his worries, his undeveloped musings, and an account of his date with Susan, which Julian had begun writing in his head as it was happening. That he wasn't all there could be seen from his face, something Susan enjoyed knowing because it made her feel as if she understood him more deeply than she really could in such a short time. At least, that was what Julian believed she meant by asking what he was thinking about. He'd said, "You." She, not one to pretend to blush out of weak romantic gesture, asked him whether he knew enough about her to think for so long. This could be understood as an insult and an offhand remark. In his letter, he argued well for either interpretation, and went on to recount the rest of their date, along with more of these annotations and reflections. All of this was packed into a single email. Leon began his response that evening, and sent it 4 days from then. He thanked Julian for reminding him of a past success, believing that was the main reason for his question. Leon had visited mosques, the Blue Mosque in Istanbul and others elsewhere, taking photos whenever and wherever permitted. As silly as it sounds, he needed to explain what his readers saw in these photos. They knew what blue was and what a mosque was, but the full importance, the full color, needed to be put into words. He called a mosque ornate, its ceiling high, its art geometric. Suddenly, they had the words to describe these photos, and their memories of other things ornate or high or geometric informed what they saw in them. This was the theory he put to Julian, who supposed it was as he said, but only supposed. There were no parallels Julian could draw to his own life that would give evidence for or against it. Lacking that, he looked at the arguments in abstract and came away with the same opinion. "You may be right," he wrote, "but how can we know?" Letters such as theirs rarely dealt with serious matters, and were clumsy when they did. Neither man knew it. Julian let his thoughts on Leon's theory be published alongside the letter that had started them down this path. Leon was on surer ground, explaining how he had found a spot in a mosque a good distance apart from the men praying, and then studied them from there. Julian was more eloquent, writing what he and Susan had said and done on their second date. Again they exchanged letters. Leon mentioned where he was and what he visited, so Julian could follow along. Beginning in the north, he had circled most of the country and returned from the south. Julian marked his progress with Susan just as conscientiously, although he had a harder time knowing where he was with her. She suggested they go hiking, then assured him it would be a matter of hours, not a full day. He had nothing against it in that case, and if they forgot the time, he would just have to tough it out. Both Bill and Leon congratulated him in the same way. It was only when he read the rest of their letters that he could tell them apart. Bill recommended he jog in the morning to prepare. He did, and promised to tell Bill about his progress when the week was over. Although Leon didn't mean to keep Julian in the dark about it, and in fact, remember, told him the stations of his journey, it nevertheless came as a surprise when he read that Leon had finished his exploration of Turkey and was on a plane going home. Julian had likewise forgotten much of what he had written in that time. Leon would choose what was fit to be published. They'd discuss it in person, without time to compose their thoughts, and since they were so happy to see each other, he imagined there would be no need for it either. As he and Susan went further along their chosen trail, his thoughts turned to what was beside him. He pointed to a red flower. "What do you call that?" "Oh, they're already here," she said, and explained it was seasonal. He asked again, and got the answer he wanted. A cardinal. This time they hugged when saying goodbye. Whether Leon slept or looked out of the plane window, it made no difference to how little he thought. He had done so much on his travels that even his dreams lacked energy and color. Holding his head against the airline's complimentary pillow, Leon tried to still the anticipation he felt for meeting Julian and Susan. That was All the World Wants to Know by Philip Ballerscheff. As always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. And again, as always, you can find a link in the description of this video that will take you to the blog post that I'm reading from. So, thanks for listening, and until next time.